Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. I have for you 5 vibrating jig tips that will make you a better vibrating jig fisherman and increase the number of bites that you get. These are simple tips that will greatly improve the effectiveness of your bait. Before I get into these 5 tips, I do want to remind you, if you want to support the channel, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link to make your tackle purchases. Also, if you're looking for more content from me, I've got a whole pile of members only videos. So check out the members only page of the YouTube channel. It's got a ton of additional information as well as monthly live streams and direct access to me if that's something you're looking for. It's a great way to support the channel as well. All right, so let's get into these vibrating jig tips. We all know how good a vibrating jig can be, especially when it comes to generating some of those bigger than average size bites. It truly is a bait that catches big ones. But if you're not familiar with the bait, you can't necessarily just go out and cast and wind and expect to catch a pile of fish. It's a bait that really requires the angler to impart a lot of that action that generates the strikes. So one of the biggest keys when it comes to fishing a vibrating jig is to choose a trailer that maximizes that erratic motion, meaning you want a trailer that will not create drag on the bait. So you're better off, in my opinion, going with a trailer like this Power Stinger that has a straight tail so that when you snap the rod tip or speed up your reel retrieve, that bait darts side to side. If you go with something like a big craw with big flappers, what happens is that craw, those flappers grab water and create a lot of water disturbance, and therefore it creates drag on your bait, and therefore does not allow your vibrating jig to shoot back and forth. So my number one tip is just comes down to your trailer choice. You want to choose something that will allow the bait to have maximum amount of erratic motion, because that erratic motion is what generates strikes. So it could be a power stinger, it could be a straight tail worm, it could be a fluke style bait, something that doesn't have a lot of grab in the water. Don't throw a big craw. I'm not saying you won't catch fish on it, but generally speaking, you're really limiting the amount of motion that you get out of it. So the second tip comes down to trimming your skirt. Most people do not trim the skirt ups on their vibrating jigs. I highly recommend taking about half of the skirt material off from the underneath side of the skirt. So you've got two sides of the skirt. You've got the top portion, which lays over it, and then you've got the bottom portion, which is underneath where your tied collar is. And by removing a bunch of that skirt material, what you do is you give a lot more um, room for your skirt to breathe. So you get a lot better motion out of it. The thicker your skirt is, the more it prohibits the movement to the skirt. So I highly recommend removing about half of the material from the bottom part of your skirt. That's going to maximize the amount of motion that you get out of it. And at the same time, it's going to reduce the drag that we were just talking about. If you remove some of that skirt material, that's allowing good water motion, which is going to help increase that darting motion of your bait every time you snap your rod or speed up your reel retrieve. The next comes down to matching the blade with the type of cover that you're fishing. And what I mean by that is, what I have found is this one right here, this is the Berkeley Slobber Knocker. This has a straight bar connection. And what that means is you do not get nearly as much rolling of the bait. The Slobber Knocker comes through wood cover extremely well because it cannot roll. So when it hits that log, it almost acts as a weed guard. The blade prevents the hook from rolling into the log. If you go with something more like the Z-Man chatterbait or the jackhammer, you have much more rotation of that hook. So when you hit that log, you have greater chance of that hook rolling into the tree and getting hung up. So if you're fishing around a lot of wood, I think you're better off going with more of a bar connection because it's going to come through the wood better. If you're fishing around grass, you might want something more like the jackhammer, which is going to rotate better and therefore it allows you to snap it out of the grass better. It's a great way to create that explosion that generates a lot of those reactionary strikes. So you want to pay attention to the type of blade that you're using compared to the structure that you're fishing. Next up is I generally think you're better off going with a painted blade. The painted blade dulls down the amount of flash that you have, and it seems to generate more strikes. I would be willing to bet you that the majority of pros out there and the best vibrating jig fishermen out there prefer to use a painted blade versus something more along the lines of a straight silver blade. Now, I will add that the one time I like to throw a silver blade is if I'm fishing primarily around a shad spawn. At that point, sometimes more flash is better. But generally speaking, most people would argue that a painted blade outproduces a silver blade almost any day of the week. So go with a painted blade. Generally, you're going to generate more strikes because of that. The last thing has to do with the bait itself and how to generate strikes. The bait vibrates great when you just straight retrieve it, but what you have to realize is it's one of the best baits at generating reaction strikes. But you have to impart the action to generate that reaction strike, meaning if you just straight retrieve it, you're not doing much to create that reactionary strike. But the great thing about a vibrating jig is that it has a lot of irregular motion already built into it. But if you can impart a little bit more of a erratic motion, either through snapping your rod tip or changing the retrieval speed just by turning the reel handle, what you're going to do is create more different types of retrievals during that entire cast, meaning the more you can get this bait to dart, the more you can get it to just skip a beat. That's going to be what generates a reaction strike. If this bait just comes back with a perfect vibration all the way back, you're not doing anything to impart a reactionary strike. If you can get it to come and then quick dart to a side, that's what generates those reaction strikes. So you want to impart that action using a change of pace on your reel handle turns or just by using small little snaps of your retrieval with the rod. Those are things that are going to increase the number of bites. So all of these tips together will maximize the number of bites that you get. You know, the more that you can get this bait to dart side to side, the more you can get it to vibrate and really not be dragged down in the water column, the more you're going to generate more strikes. So by doing things like trimming your skirt, choosing the right blade, choosing the right trailer, and imparting some additional action with your rod tip, you're going to get a lot more strikes. These are things that the best vibrating jig fishermen are doing out there. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of newer anglers are frustrated with a vibrating jig. They're not getting many strikes on it, but it's because they're not doing the things necessary to increase the number of bites. It is a bait that generates strikes, but it is a great bait when you truly learn how to fish it. So hopefully these tips were helpful. If they were, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new tip for you tomorrow.